Thank you so much, Sarah, and I want to add my words of welcome to all of you. I am so excited to be kicking off this inaugural Humanities Forum here at Rhodes House and welcoming folks from all over the world who are coming here for what I know will be two rich and stimulating and provocative days of conversation. Before we begin, I want to also thank our fabulous co-conveners. Professor Boehmer is one of them, Elleke Boehmer, and our other co-convener is Karen O'Brien, Professor Karen O'Brien, who heads the Humanities Division here at Oxford. So Elleke and Karen, thank you for your leadership. Both are Rhodes trustees, and so contribute to the work of the trust in all sorts of ways. I also want to thank the folks who really made this happen and who worked so hard to make this happen. You know, one of the beautiful things about Rhodes forums is that they are scholar organized. And if you go to your little booklet and you find the, I guess it's page 33, so it's toward the back of the book, I just encourage you to take a look at that. And you will see this fabulous group of Rhodes scholars there from, I think, if I'm counting right, 6 different Rhodes constituencies from around the world who have organized this, very ably led by Lucas Tse and Sarah Walcher. If you would all please join me, and actually, if you're a member of that scholar organizing team, would you please stand up so we can recognize you, see you, and thank you. Great. So great. And I also want to thank my wonderful colleagues at Rhodes House, Rodolfo Lara, Hannah Warren, Karina Lang, Babette Littlemore, Georgie Thurston, and Sophie Crow, and the whole events team for making this happen. So this is the inaugural Rhodes Forum on the Humanities. I have been here now for about 14 months, I guess, 15 months. And when I arrived as warden, it was one of the first things as I thought about our programming. We have been running Rhodes Forums now for about 4 years. So we haven't been running them, I should kind of make this clear, for 25 years. We've been running them for about 4 years and have gathered on themes like gathering women, Rhodes Women, for the 40th anniversary of Rhodes Women. We've had an LGBTQ forum. We've had a forum on climate change, on healthcare, on entrepreneurship, our Ventures Forum, on public leadership. But as I thought about what was part of our offering, and as I started talking to people in the Rhodes community, one of the themes that came up again and again, and quite powerfully, and might I say at times insistently, was we should convene around the humanities. That there are, for the world today, it is so important to bring the voices from the humanities to bear on the important conversations happening in our world today, and that there are people, so many people in the Rhodes community who are in the humanities and who have felt maybe a little neglected in these Rhodes conversations. I just looked asked my wonderful colleague, Mary Eaton, to look up the current percentages. Currently 13%, so it's a fairly low, but not insignificant percentage. 13% of current Rhodes scholars are studying in the humanities. And so I wanted to mention that as we begin this conversation, that this is a theme around which I think there's some real passion within the Rhodes community and a sense that it is a conversation overdue to talk about the role of the humanities in important narratives of change. And so I'm delighted here and honored to be with Elleke and Lyndsey, 2 professors, distinguished scholars and educators, both of whom are the first to hold the chair, I believe, that you hold. So the first professor of world literature at Oxford and the first interdisciplinary professor of the humanities and human rights. So in other words, they are trailblazers. And so I want to begin by asking each of you if you would briefly share your journey as a humanist, how you ended up being the first holder of this kind of cutting edge role for each of you. And maybe Lyndsey, I'll start with you.
Thank you. It's very exciting to be here and a real honor. When you asked me this question before, I was thinking, where did that really start? And I have to confess, I think my journey started when I dropped out of school. Don't do this. I know there are A-level students. This is not a how-to. But I didn't go back to university until my 20s. And what I did in between time was I read a lot. I was an autodidact. I read compulsively, I read passionately. And I was an activist. This was the 80s. And I always thought the humanities were about the question of how we live together. I didn't think they were anything else. The books I was reading were giving me answers to those questions. So when I went back into education, that was always my framework. And it was sometimes in my work and it sometimes wasn't. And as I worked through, I did a lot of work. I mean, I worked my way through Holocaust studies, through trauma theory. I wrote a book on Nuremberg and the coming of human rights just after World War II. And I became more and more convinced that the relationship between imagining justice and imagining other worlds that my human rights law colleagues were doing and had done over history, and the work that writers were doing and I was doing, were joined at the hip. So I just kept on moving along that trajectory. And finally got offered in negotiation the job at Birmingham, whereupon my mother looked at me and said, "You're so greedy, how many humans do you want in one job title?" So, Mum, you can never have enough humanity in one job title. So.
Beautiful.
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to add my voice to Elizabeth to sort of to celebrate this moment, but to question the celebration also, because I think, I mean, you know, none of us can disguise or hide the fact that the humanities has had a bad rap, a kind of a bit of a negative rap in recent time, maybe the last 15, 20 years in certainly in the academy in this country. And there's been the sense that, and it's certainly kind of reflected in those numbers, I think, that you showed a moment ago, Elizabeth. I think there's the sense that in terms of the really important debates of our time, to pick up on what Lyndsey said a moment ago, human rights or climate change, you know, for solutions, for, you know, the compelling answers to the very big questions, you know, science has more to contribute, or the social sciences have more to contribute than the humanities. And this is something that, in my experience, and I'm getting now onto my trajectory, I've always been mystified by, because it seems to me that, you know, the important change makers of, say, the 20th century, I'm looking at the face of Nelson Mandela back there, they always used stories to understand the world analytically and to break down a problem and to kind of to move to a solution. So I'm one of those people. I was really interested in sort of, Lyndsey also had a kind of fork in the road experience. I was at school a science nerd, you know, physics, chemistry, that was maths, that was my brief. And I went to university initially to study medicine. And about a year and a half in, I gave it up. It's a complicated story why, but I was missing the analysis, the kind of heuristic power, the interpretive power of story, of crafted language in understanding some of the problems of illness, of epidemic, and also of, you know, other kinds of illness, you know, of a sense of alienation in society. I was missing the answers that the humanities could bring. That's at a slightly higher level of abstraction that I wanted to begin with. But, you know, I feel that we were talking earlier about celebrating the humanities with this amazing forum, but I think Lyndsey and I also felt that we feel quite militant about the humanities. We really feel that the contribution that we can make from a humanities perspective is a vital contribution that needs to be at the kind of the main table of discussion.
So militant about the humanities, and I love Elleke the way you frame this as, the humanities is sometimes seen as a place where deep questions are asked but not necessarily answered, or solutions are offered. So I really like that, the way you framed that. And so I'd love to ask both of you, as you think about the contribution of humanistic modes of interpretation, modes of analysis, of intellectual and practical work grounded in the humanities, what is distinctive about that you don't find, or you find much less in other fields?
That's a great question. I think it is depth. I mean, some of the work that both of us have been doing, working with social scientists or lawyers in protection environments, which are always targeted on the now. We need to stop this from happening now. We need to do this absolutely now. And the project I'm just involved in at the moment is called Rights for Time. And it's saying, well, one of the reasons you can't solve this problem, we keep on failing to solve this problem, is you haven't got a temporal compass here. You can't see that the trauma you're dealing with is actually 48 years old or longer. And so, I mean, the humanities does bring that depth, for one thing. And also gets into kind of levels of human experience which are difficult to instrumentalize. Ambiguity, doubt, love, care, which, I've been working on a project called Refugee Hosts, where I work with social scientists, and we run poetry workshops with communities who are hosting refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. And quite often we'll turn up on the social side. When we first started doing this, we were running these poetry workshops, and my social scientist colleague kept on saying, "What's the control here?" We'd say, "It's poetry, Alistair." And then, over time, he just became extraordinarily engrossed with the narratives that were being produced out of that encounter, and could see how that was working.
Yes, so that they frame problems in a different way.
Yeah.
They give you that depth, the length as well.
But one thing, just to add just a big picture, I do firmly believe that a culture that doesn't value humanities will not be a human rights culture, and that everybody knows that. People who are working hard to get the humanities in developing countries, people who are battling to be able to teach people literature, art, philosophy. And it's a question we need to ask in the US and in Europe at the moment, when the humanities are blatantly not just dwindling, but actually under attack.
Yes. Yes.
Just to add another word into the mix, interpretation. I think the humanities have to do with kind of perspective and vantage point, and how different groups and individuals approach a particular problem from their particular perspective, and that is seen as soft, as against data analysis, kind of the quantifiable. I was at a fascinating discussion not long ago about, or between physicists and social workers, about the impact. It was really interesting in the light of this discussion about the impact of the square kilometer array telescope that's now being built in the Karoo and also in Western Australia. The impact of that new technology in the desert on local communities. And the physicists kept saying to the social workers, give us data. How many people are suffering from illnesses related to the coming of the telescope? And the social workers kept saying, a moment, that doesn't get to the heart of what people are feeling about this amazing telescope that's generating incredible data from the Big Bang into the present. That doesn't get to the heart of the heart, and that's an interesting word in the humanities, that doesn't get to the heart of what these people are suffering, experiencing from day to day. We need to listen to their stories. The physicists came back. story? What is that? Where's the data in that? And of course, they were both absolutely valid, but I think to support what Lyndsey just said, in recent time, the voice of the storytellers and the social workers dealing with those issues, the human experience in that environment, hasn't been listened to in quite the same acute way as say, in this case, the physics has.
Yes. Well, so we've been talking, and I'm sure we'll come back to the kind of how the humanities are understood and misunderstood by other fields, other perspectives. I'd like to now just get your thoughts on what about within the umbrella of the humanities, have in your careers, have people looked at you and said, well, but you're doing kind of instrumental humanities focused on human rights or focused on, empowering the global South, and is that somehow not pure humanity? So, what's your thought on that notion of, is it appropriate for the humanities to be pursued in the service of something?
Yeah, as I was saying before, I think the humanities has always been in the service of something, forever. Whether it's, Athenian democracy or, Renaissance in Europe, it always has. So when I get that kind of pushback, I think, well, you can only actually sort of talk about a non-instrumental humanities from a position of privilege, because you haven't got any battles. So as we were saying before, the humanities is always being about putting new things in the world. It's always been about being in a bigger world. Even when Kant talks about the aesthetic, he says it's about the community. You don't make aesthetic judgments by yourself, because otherwise you're just sitting there going, I like it, I don't like it. He says, no, aesthetics is about making judgments with one another. It's social. So even at its purest, the humanities have always been historically engaged and doing things in the world. I mean, the word poiesis goes back to the Greek. It means to produce, to bring something new into the world. That's what poetry does. So I would kind of push back at the instrumentalization of pure humanities. I might push back on pure maths as well, because I think that's always doing something too. But particularly with the humanities, I think it's a kind of false framing, and it usually means someone wants to carry on doing the right to what they're doing, which is like it's fine or not fine.
Which they've defined as neutral.
Which they've defined as neutral. So all humanities endeavour is about human understanding. That's why it's so great. So and then people do it because they want something to happen in the world.
Yes, and that, I love that. We were talking a bit earlier this morning about that you think about, the plays of Aeschylus and Lyndsey, you were mentioning Shelley and Keats, and all of these were, they were trying to make things happen in the world through imagination, through
But it
provocation.
also really matters. I mean, the aesthetic, being good at this stuff matters. So if Jefferson had just said something like, let's get independence done, it might not have turned out so well. Or if Frederick Douglass hadn't just sort of described his experience but invented a new narrative, then that kind of human rights would have happened. Or Shelley hadn't managed to make the human voice sing. So it really, the aesthetic bit is the change bit.
Yes.
And part of all of this, the medium of all of this, is also language. I mean, the humanities reflect on the very tools of our self-expression, one of which is the language we all use. Two pure mathematicians having a discussion about, some amazing new problem of fractal maths. They use language. They use language in a certain way. They use language to persuade. They use language to describe. And what we do in the humanities, in part, is to reflect on those languages, to think about them, to enhance them, to clarify them, to adjust them relative to other points of view.
Right. So, thinking then about, Elleke, you mentioned how the humanities for the past 15 or 20 years have been kind of under attack And yet, it is, you've both, I think, made such a persuasive case for the power of the humanities to illuminate the world, to contribute to the framing of problems, to push important questions about normativity, about the why, about justice, about all of those sorts of things. So is the problem that people just don't see it, or is it that they see it and are threatened by it? Is it that that humanistic scholars aren't embracing that power of the humanities in the world? I guess it's a big, complicated question, but I guess I'd be interested in, maybe another way of framing it is, I was trained as a philosopher, and people have sometimes said that philosophy was saved by applied ethics. The discipline of philosophy was saved by applied ethics, where people kind of claimed the power of philosophical analysis to illuminate and comment on practical issues. And I mean, that's a contentious claim that it was saved by, but I've heard that, and, should humanists do more or claim that they are, or frame that they are doing applied humanities?
I think it's the argument around application. It's the argument around the instrumentalization. I mean, perhaps we have, to some extent, been our own worst enemies. Perhaps we should be bolder about application and about, the utility of the aesthetic, in the current time. Perhaps we should simply be less shy about the benefits of what we do.
Yeah, and I think the two sides. One is the humanities have always thrived when they have a mission.
Yes.
And sometimes we might not like that mission, the colonial mission of teaching English, for instance, or the post-war humanities mission in the UK or the US. And I think there has been a problem that the humanities doesn't quite know what its mission is at the moment. We need to sort that out. So I think some of the most interesting work that's happening for the humanities at the moment, and you know more about this than me, and other people will in the room too, is coming from South Africa. So how do you imagine human life, human experience, consensual human relationships after apartheid? You don't keep on teaching the humanities in the way you used to. You have to imagine something else. So I think there's that side. So we're not doing enough of that. But also, I don't think we should be naive about the attack on humanities. It is real. It is happening. It happened in Hungary. That was, the Central European University was a humanities, social science-based university. Most Americans in the room will know the now annual attack on the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities coming every year to cut all funding, so far resisted. Last night I looked up the percentage of research funding for the humanities in this country. And okay, I'm not a mathematician, but just on research councils it came to 2.37% of our overall budget. I added in some other things because I can do some maths, like the British Council, etc., etc. I still can get it above 7%. So the attacks on the humanities and the arts are very, very real. And they are political, and it is part of something we need to worry about. But on the other hand, the kind of inspiration is coming from those places who are battling to find new terms from humanity out of appalling consequences. And I think that's why I would look south for new definitions of humanity right now.
Yes, fascinating. Elleke, would you look south? I guess you have looked south.
I do yes. I do look south. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the attack on the humanities or the critique of the humanities is always an interested critique. And when we hear it, and I'm sure everyone in the room will be able to remember a moment in which you heard the critique, you hear that kind of, that doubting, acerbic attack on the humanities, there is always interest behind it. There is some sort of interest behind it, a political interest. I mean, and let's not kid ourselves. Also, just to pick up something that Lyndsey said a moment ago, the humanities, big stories have also been used for very dark missions. I mean, I'm reminded of ways in which Kipling has been chanted. Rudyard Kipling has been, his work has been chanted and used, both for ill and for good.
There's always that thing when people at university dinners come up to you and say, well, I hear the humanities aren't doing that well, and they've got this pitying look. And I now turn around and say, oh, yeah, I don't know if you've noticed, but humanity's not doing that great either. Maybe the two things are connected. You know, right?
Powerful stuff. Thank you both. I want to open it up now for questions from the audience. We have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So if you would raise your hand if you have a question. And are we bringing microphones? Yes, we've got, two wonderful scholars who will bring a microphone to you. And we ask you if you want to ask a question. We have a question here. Rahul is wanting to ask a question. Please, if you will just say who you are. And then we have another person following.
Yes. Hi there. I'm Rahul Bajaj. I'm a second-year scholar from India. My question somewhat picks up on what's been discussed till now, but is slightly different. And what I'm wondering is, to what extent, in your estimation, is it appropriate for people to demand that the inquiries that are conducted in the humanities be have real-world significance? So. This is something that, a couple of weeks ago I interviewed Tarunab Ketan, and this is something that I asked him about legal academia, that in my estimation, a lot of times, I was particularly disillusioned by the ways in which, some academics, I think, find solutions in search of a problem or tie themselves into knots in controversies with little practical relevance. And I think that at a university like Oxford, we should be bringing to bear the full power of our intellect in addressing real-world issues more than theoretical controversies with little practical relevance. And his answer was that what may not seem relevant today may become relevant tomorrow, and therefore demanding a certain amount of relevance from academics is a dangerous thing to do. So I'm just wondering what your reflections on that are.
Thank you.
If I understood the question correctly, it was how academics at this university should address real-world problems?
Is it appropriate to expect them to address real-world problems, or is that an unfair expectation to have?
I mean, I think the question appears to beg whether that we are not currently dealing with real-world problems, and we may need to deal more, or the question is whether what the ethics are of dealing more fully with real-world problems. I mean, I would probably give you a pushback answer, which is to say, in what sense are we not dealing already with real-world problems? I mean, in my work, for example, I deal with, in different cultural contexts, I deal with a sense of kind of alienation and marginalization that different communities express. In what sense is that not a real-world problem? I mean, I'd leave that as a rhetorical question.
Okay, Lyndsey, anything you want to add to that?
I teach at the University of Birmingham, so I'm funded, when I'm not taking funds out of the 2.37% research funding, I'm funded by student fees. So I do actually feel a real responsibility to be in the world. Because there's an awful lot of money, there's an awful lot of investment, and it's the social contract. But like Elleke, I kind of think a part of the humanities is around thinking about what it means to be in the world. And there are very different routes into thinking about that.
Yes, yes.
And the kind of questions you might want to ask aren't necessarily solution-driven.
Yes. I mean, I guess I will say, from my own experience of studying philosophy, I was always drawn to fields within philosophy that had a more direct connection with human behavior and human society, and there's certainly elements of that discipline that are maybe militantly not, but anyway, thank you for that question. We have a question there in the back. And
Hi.
Please stand up and
hi
introduce
everyone.
yourself.
I'm Rosanna. I'm a Canadian scholar from about 10 years ago. I have a question about the humanities under attack, and you were both talking about the interests behind that. I'd like to hear more about what you mean by that explicitly, because I think that's really interesting, and when I just think about it a little bit right now, I feel there's a lot of fear and a lot of scarcity that might also be driving efforts to curtail, focus on more efficiency-oriented things rather than art. So I'd love to hear more about the attack and the interests behind it.
Well, it's an economically fueled attack in part, though in fact the humanities is I mean, again, we should probably not say this too simplistically, but the humanities are quite cheap. We don't need big labs to do the amazing things that we do. So, but there is, yes, an economically fueled attack about efficiency and about results. But I think there's also a politically fueled attack, because what the humanities involve in part, we've been talking about interpretation, we've been talking about language, it involves asking questions. I mean, what science doesn't? I would, in the science in its broadest sense, its sort of, German sense of the quest after knowledge. But because what we deal with is interpretation and perspective and point of view, we are asking people about how they see the world, As in, my example of the telescope in the Karoo Desert, how the people living there feel about that telescope in their lives. That is to ask some really, really difficult questions of the scientists funded by huge labs, the physicists, the astronomers funded by huge labs who are very, very keen to get the data out of the desert, out of the telescopes in the desert. But the people on the ground dealing with the human lives there are asking some very, very difficult questions about, what are the consequences for the very few, actually? I mean, there's tiny communities, 179 in the most affected small town, there's a sense that it rocks the political boat, it rocks the status quo to ask some of the questions that the humanities encourage us to ask.
I'd go even further. I'd say it's connected to how we understand democracy. And I think it was John Adams, Sarah Churchwell did a good op-ed in The Hire, who said, I'm studying maths, science, and these things, so my children, the next generation, could study arts, history, philosophy. So it's always connected, I think, the humanities to building democracy. And I do think that's why, part of the reason why humanities are under attack at the moment. Because the humanities ask questions like, why did that happen? Did that have to happen? Could that have happened another way? Why is that happening? Was that a good thing to think? Was that a good thing to do? So in some ways, the business of being a citizen is very much connected to the training that comes from the humanities. It's no accident when George Soros set up the Central European University in Hungary, it was the humanities and social sciences he was promoting. And there's a reason for that, which is his idea of what connected democracy to notions of freedom, and one of those answers was the humanities. So I really do think we need to take this really, really seriously. There is a question not about just the academy. There's questions about citizenships, and there's questions about what kind of democracy we want to live in. And the humanities are constantly pushing that. I mean, I don't think you have many huge humanities programs in countries that are not on their way to democracy or democracies.
Yes, yes, it's very powerful claim. Okay, we've got a bunch of hands up. What I'd like to suggest, because we're short on time, is maybe we take 3 or 4 questions in a row, and then you all can figure out which ones or how you want to address them. So let's see. We've got in the 4th row here, yes, and then a gentleman in the front, and 2 people there. So let's take those 4 questions. Just if you can keep your questions short. Let's get the questions out there, and we'll...
Hi, I'm Yali. I'm a first-year scholar from China, and I think I'm asking a pretty concrete question of applied humanities. That I attended a lecture on human trafficking, and the lecturer there offered 2 narratives on how to understand the human trafficking solicitation. One is that, of course, it's a solicitation of a crime, but the another narrative is that they are all normal human beings, their relatives, people earning a living and a really small money by human trafficking. And by that, I think I'm asking, so what kind of factors will you consider to choose which narrative will you go? Because that really have some choose real meaning, or how we should frame our policy to deal with these problems.
Great, thank you. So let's see, we have another question here. I'll try to remember. So how you select.
It's a comment you might want to comment on yourself, but it's the word. One of the words that's coming up, or hasn't been said yet, but is that humanities are under attack because they are potentially subversive, either to economic interests or political interests.
Thank you. We've got a question here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dhruva. I'm a third-year Indian scholar. So I've been here for a while. My question is, especially from South Africa, I saw for the first time really the role of protest music and songs. And one thing that I'd love for you to touch on is the role of the humanities in bringing joy to protest and change and pushing for progress.
Yeah.
I'm Edward Mortimer from All Souls. I'd like to ask a question which probably everybody here thinks they already know the answer to. What are the humanities? And how do you decide what is and what is not a humanity? I think one of you referred to humanities and social science, sort of bracketing them together, but clearly distinct. Another question was about law, and I'm not even sure whether law is a humanity or not. Can you help me?
All right, so 4 very rich questions here. So we have what are the humanities? We have questions around the humanities as subversive, how humanities bring joy, and then with using a case, an example of human trafficking, how do you select the narrative frame? So who wants to tackle?
Well, just 2 things quickly. I thought that was a great example of why we need the humanities, because what we do in literature training is precisely what narrative path we're going to take here. That's what 3 years of reading very long 19th century novels and novels from World War will teach you how to do. And that's exactly why we need the humanities involved in those questions. That's such a great example. And also to respond to joy, yes. Absolutely, and I really think that's happening now. I think the kind of activism that's happening now is it's got this high, I don't know where it's coming from, high joy, which is about delight. When people talk about humanities being dilettante, dilettante comes from the origins of to delight. And absolutely, that affirmation. What the humanities are, I think, is a great question. I would say human experience, human history, human relationality, but then we go into the social sciences. But I think the humanities are always evolving. That's what's really interesting. So my college, law, I'm in the College of Arts and Law, which is a throwback from whenever. I find this delightful because I hang out with human rights lawyers and global international lawyers. And we have an awful lot to talk about in terms of what narratives are precedent, what has to change, what assumption of humanity is working there. So that kind of grey area, I think, is something to be welcomed. But I also think the humanities do need to evolve. So having courses which are on joy, I mean, that'd be a great course. Or sort of thinking again about what we understand by our human community and then getting the study we need in order to understand that and do that better is always going to be, we hope, evolving.
To give it a little bit of pushback on joy, that's very killjoy of me, isn't it? But I'm as much as I celebrate that high octane kind of the energy of current activism, I'm always a little careful in a kind of assigning or consigning the humanities to kind of the expression of certain very positive emotions or sort of very significant emotions. I mean, you also often hear, we turn to the humanities in moments when we're seeking consolation, in moments of grief, in moments of the need to come together and to heal after, some trauma or some loss. And I mean, that is absolutely true. But it's, to that we need to add the very, very important reminder that those things do not happen, as it were, at times of extremity alone. they are also, the humanities addresses the entire gamut, the entire range of human experience. It is in the real world, to go back to that, to the question from your neighbor. Yeah.
Super. Okay, so we're just about out of time. What I'd like to ask in closing, I'd like to ask each of you to offer a minute or so of concluding reflections, maybe about questions or themes that you hope this group gathered over the next 2 days will explore, will think about. Advice for the participants, I guess, is what I'm.
Well,
asking.
gosh, it's a usefully ambitious ask. I guess what would be fantastic is if we could all reflect on our own, we've been talking about interpretation, reflect on our own practice through this workshop, through these 2 days together, and to think about, especially perhaps those who are not kind of, I don't know, our guests from other disciplines, but everybody, to reflect on the kinds of stories that you are telling, even as you ask your questions, the kinds of stories that you are riposting to the speakers with as they speak. Just really kind of think about those stories as change makers. I'm trying in my response to bring together the narrative element of the workshop title and the change element, and to just kind of really think about the stories we tell, but also, the great poetry, the laments and so on that drive changed understanding.
Thank you. Lyndsey.
Yeah, two things. I've changed my mind slightly. What I was going to say. Maybe two things. One, and I'm just picking up on Edward Mortimer's question here. One is to share your experiences of the humanities, because we're a pretty international group here, and it's quite rare to get so many people in one room over 2 days to actually have proper conversations. So I think actually doing some comparative work about your experience of the humanities and what you think the humanities might do would be one thing I think would be really interesting to get some feedback on, because there's lots of different practices, and we all talk about humanities like we think we know what we're talking about, but from university to university, from country to country, from generation to generation, they're going to be different things. Aligned to that, I mean, this is again coming with my human rights hat on, is the question of when we talk about universal humanity or universal human rights, which has been something very difficult to do for all sorts of reasons. Quite good reasons, like the kind of universalism as a new form of oppression, or dodgy narratives around the universal, but for some very bad reasons too. So I would quite like some reflections on how the humanities can reinvent those notions of what it is we share, what's our moral responsibility to one another as world citizens, and how the humanities can engage back with those questions of universality. Maybe universality is not the right word, moral responsibility and co-living on the planet.
Wonderful. So reinvention, change, a wonderful start to our conversation from these two amazing scholars and militant humanists. Can you please join me in thanking Lyndsey and Elleke?